They say no one survives a storm like that, but Jesse Dalton found someone the wind itself refused to take. Through the white roar of snow, a dark figure half buried beside a fallen horse, a woman dressed in black, her hair frozen to her face and a wedding ring glinting through the ice. He didn't know her name, didn't ask where she came from. He just lifted her into his arms and rode into the wind, knowing only one thing: she was still warm enough to save. Sometimes, the people we rescue aren't strangers at all. They're the pieces of ourselves we lost along the way. If this story reaches your heart tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the next tale beneath these western skies. Wishing you a quiet evening and a little warmth, wherever you are. The night over Widow's Pass had no mercy to give. It was a black sea of snow and wind, churning across the ridges like a beast that had forgotten how to rest. Pines bowed low under the weight of ice, their branches cracking like gunfire in the distance. The moon had vanished hours ago. Only the faint glow of drifted snow caught what little light the world had left. Down that narrow trail, a lone horse fought its way through the storm, hooves sinking deep into the white abyss, breath rising in clouds of steam. On its back rode a man and a boy, silhouettes carved from stubbornness and survival. Jesse Dalton, broad-shouldered and raw-boned, leaned forward against the saddle, his hat pinned low, his coat crusted with ice. He was a man in his mid-30s, face worn by wind and long winters, eyes gray as the mountains he called home. Beside him, clinging to the horse's mane with both gloved hands, was his son Tommy, 8 years old, small for his age, freckles hidden under the frost clinging to his cheeks. The boy's lips trembled blue, yet his eyes were wide open, as if watching for something beyond the storm itself. The horse, a gray gelding named Scout, old and loyal, pressed forward one step then another through the white rage that swallowed sound and sense. They had been riding since dusk, searching for a safe pass back to the valley before the snow cut off the trail completely. The wind came from every direction, turning the air into knives. Jesse's fingers were numb, his face stiff, and each breath burned like he was swallowing ice. He glanced at his boy, pulled his scarf higher over the child's mouth, and muttered, "Almost there, son. Just hold on." But his words disappeared, torn apart by the screaming wind. Then, through the swirling curtain of snow, something shifted, a dark smear against the endless white. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree, a shadow thrown by the storm, but as Scout stumbled closer, Jesse saw the truth. A horse lying on its side, half buried in snow, saddle twisted, reins stiff with frost, and beside it, a shape that didn't belong to the wilderness, a figure in black, still as stone, one arm stretched toward the empty sky. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. He dismounted, boots sinking into the snow up to his knees. The wind clawed at his coat as he bent down. The fallen horse, a bay mare, was young, strong once, but its eyes were glazed with frost, nostrils frozen shut. The woman beside it was barely visible beneath a layer of snow. Her hair, dark and tangled with ice, had spilled across her face. She wore a black wool cloak, torn at the shoulder, the edges stiff and silvered by frost. Her gloved hand rested over her chest, and through the cracked fabric of her sleeve, a thin gold wedding ring glinted faintly, a stubborn spark refusing to die. "Pa?" Tommy's voice trembled from the saddle. "Is that someone?" "Stay put," Jesse barked, though his voice softened a moment later. He knelt, brushing the snow from her face. Her skin was cold, too cold, but not the kind of cold that belonged to the dead. He pressed his ear close to her lips. For a long second, there was nothing, only the wind. Then, faint as a whisper through glass, a breath. "She's alive," he muttered, more to himself than the boy. Without thinking, he pulled his coat open, wrapped it around her shoulders, and lifted her into his arms. She was light, far too light for someone grown. The weight of a ghost, he thought. Her head fell against his chest as he turned back toward Scout. "Hold her hand, son," he said, placing the woman behind Tommy on the saddle. "Don't let go. You understand?" Tommy nodded, small hands gripping hers through the cloak. They were stiff, the fingers curled inward as if she'd been clutching something precious and lost. The boy could feel the faint pulse against his palm, a fragile thud like a bird's wing in the dark. Jesse climbed up, took the reins, and with a click of his tongue urged Scout forward. The horse hesitated, snorted, then obeyed, pushing through the storm once more. The wind howled louder, wrapping around them like a living thing. For miles there was nothing but white, no stars, no trail, no sound, but the groan of wind and the faint rattle of the woman's breath. Jesse's mind fought between focus and fear. He'd seen storms bury men alive out here, trappers, travelers, families who thought they could outlast the mountains. He refused to let that happen, not with his boy watching. "Pa!" Tommy's voice cracked. "She's not moving." "She will," Jesse said, though he wasn't sure. He kept his eyes forward, searching for the dim outline of the ridge. Somewhere beyond that ridge was the old logging road, and his cabin, a mile from the creek. If he could reach it, there'd be fire, blankets, life. The storm thickened. The air turned white to the point of blindness. Scout stumbled, caught himself, and kept going. Jesse's arms were lead, his back stiff, but he refused to stop. Every minute mattered. The woman's head leaned against Tommy's shoulder, strands of frozen hair brushing the boy's cheek. "Pa!" Tommy whispered again, quieter now, as if afraid to disturb her. "Is she gonna die?" Jesse's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. The truth had no warmth tonight. He could feel her breath faltering against the wind, the rhythm of it lost between gusts. Somewhere behind them, the storm gave a deep, rolling moan, the kind of sound the mountains made when snow loosened its grip and came roaring down. He didn't look back. He couldn't. All that mattered was forward. They reached the lower ridge where wind turned the snow into waves. The lantern Jesse kept strapped to his saddle swung wildly, its faint flame flickering in defiance. Through that dim light, he saw the woman's face again, pale, unmoving, lashes, crusted with ice, lips parted slightly as if caught mid-prayer. He wondered what name she'd spoken last before the storm took her. Tommy's hands trembled, fingers numb. The woman's wrist slipped in his grip once. He caught it again, pressing it tight. The horse pushed through a drift and stumbled. Jesse cursed under his breath, pulling the reins hard. They were close now. He could almost smell the wet wood of the cabin chimney, the memory of smoke. But the wind screamed louder, clawing through the pass like something jealous. The snow rose around them in swirling sheets, and in that chaos, Tommy felt her hand twitch, then go still. "Pa!" he cried, twisting around, but the world was a blur of white and motion. Jesse turned just in time to see it, her arm sliding away, glove slipping from Tommy's grasp. The horse lurched forward. Her hand fell into the storm's mouth, swallowed by the dark. And for a moment, Jesse thought he heard something carried by the wind. Not a scream, not a sigh, but a whisper of a name, lost between snow and silence. Then the sound was gone, and all that remained was the storm, unending and alive. The cabin door burst open with the wind, snow swirling inside before Jesse could shove it closed. The world outside vanished behind a wall of white, leaving only the dim interior, a single room smelling of pine resin and cold iron. Shadows clung to the log walls, and the fire in the stone hearth hissed weakly, struggling against the storm that still raged beyond the door. Jesse moved quickly, his breath fogging the air, his hands raw and red, as he laid the woman down on a wool blanket near the flames. Her skin was ice pale, lips blue as winter dusk, and when he brushed her hair from her face, frost fell like glass dust onto the floorboards. He stripped the frozen coat from her shoulders, careful not to tear the fabric where it had stiffened with ice. Underneath, her dress was black wool, trimmed with lace long ruined by weather. The cloth clung to her arms as though fused there, heavy with meltwater. Tommy, wide-eyed and silent, stood by the hearth, clutching firewood like an offering. His small hands trembled, not from fear, but from the solemn duty he understood even without words, that this woman's breath depended on theirs. "More wood, son," Jesse said quietly. "We need the fire to breathe before she does." The boy nodded and dropped to his knees, stacking logs, the sound of dry bark cracking sharp in the hush. Jesse rubbed the woman's arms briskly through the quilt, pressing warmth into her as if his own heartbeat could jump to hers. He worked by instinct, the same way he once calmed dying horses, steady, gentle, unrelenting. Outside, the storm beat against the shutters, but in that small circle of firelight, life and death wrestled in silence. He poured water from the kettle, added a handful of herbs, and set the tin mug near the fire until the scent of chamomile and pine filled the room. When he lifted her head and pressed the cup to her lips, the first drop slid down her chin, then another. A cough, soft, cracked but alive, trembled through her chest. Her eyelids fluttered once, twice, then slowly opened. The eyes beneath were gray, not the dull gray of stone, but the soft, haunted gray of morning mist. For a heartbeat, she seemed to look through him, to somewhere far beyond the walls. Then her lips moved, barely shaping the word. Samuel. The name was a wound spoken aloud. Jesse froze, the cup still in his hand. There was grief in that sound, grief older than the storm, deeper than the cold. He had heard men cry out for mercy, for God, for their mothers, but never with that hollow tenderness that came only from losing something you once believed eternal. He sat back, watching the tremor pass over her face as she drifted into sleep again. Tommy crept closer, his small voice a whisper. Pa, who's Samuel? Jesse didn't answer. He only adjusted the quilts, pulled them tighter around her shoulders, and said, Someone she's missing. Hours passed. The storm began to fade, though the wind still scraped the roof like restless fingers. The fire had found its rhythm, glowing steady now, painting the cabin walls in shades of gold and ember. Jesse sat in the chair beside her, exhaustion drawing lines across his face. He watched the rise and fall of her breathing, slow, fragile, but real. Outside, Scout stamped the ground near the shed, his bridle jangling faintly, a reminder of the world beyond the storm. At some point, Jesse dozed off, chin on his chest, hand resting on the back of the chair. When he woke, dawn was trying to push through the frost-coated window, turning the snow outside to silver light. The fire had burned low. The woman stirred, her lashes trembling against her cheeks before her eyes opened once more. For a long moment, she seemed unsure of the world she'd returned to. Her gaze darted around the cabin, the wooden beams, the small table cluttered with tools, the boy curled up under a blanket by the hearth. Then her eyes found Jesse. You pulled me out of the snow, she murmured, her voice low and rough from disuse. He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. Didn't seem right to leave you. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, then shifted slightly under the blankets. The firelight caught on her hair, dark chestnut now that the frost had melted, and on the faint bruise along her temple. Where are we? She asked. My cabin, he said simply. Widow's Pass, about 5 miles from the ridge. Widow's Pass. The name hung in the air, heavy with irony. She turned toward the window, watching the snowflakes drift lazily against the glass. It sounds like a place meant for endings. Or beginnings, Jesse said, though his tone carried no conviction. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire popped, sending a small spark toward the stones. Tommy stirred, blinked awake, and sat up. You're alive, he said softly, as if still uncertain it was true. A faint smile touched her lips, brief, like a shadow passing through light. Thanks to your father, she whispered. The boy looked proud in that quiet, awkward way children do when they sense they've witnessed something important. He fetched more wood and fed the fire without being asked. Jesse poured another cup of tea, this time cooling it with a splash of snow before handing it to her. Drink, he said. You need it. She nodded and took the mug in both hands. Her fingers were slender, pale, but the veins stood out like blue threads beneath the skin. She drank slowly, each sip measured, her gaze flicking once toward him, curious, cautious. When she finished, she let the cup rest in her lap and whispered, Thank you. He shrugged. Storm like that, I'd hope someone would do the same for me. Silence settled again, softer this time. Outside, the wind had finally lost its edge. The first sunlight crept through the window, landing on the floor where puddles of melted snow glistened. She watched it with the quiet awe of someone who hadn't seen light in too long. Then, slowly, she lifted her left hand to brush hair from her face and stopped. The gold wedding ring caught the firelight, a perfect circle glinting against her pale skin. For a long moment she stared at it, Her eyes darkened, the faint smile fading. Jesse saw her thumb rub against the metal once, twice, as if trying to erase its weight. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that some griefs could only be carried in silence. She drew a deep, unsteady breath. Then, almost gently, she slipped the ring from her finger. The metal made a small sound as it rolled against her palm. She closed her hand around it, eyes fixed on the fire, and for the first time since she had woken, her shoulders relaxed, not from comfort, but from surrender. Tommy, sensing something sacred in the moment, went still beside the hearth. The fire crackled softly, the sound like a sigh in the quiet room. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the mountains wrapped in white silence. But inside that small cabin, 3 lives sat between light and shadow: a man, a child, and a woman who had just let go of the last warmth she'd ever known. And as Jesse turned away to tend the fire, he did not see the way she pressed the ring into her palm until it vanished from sight. By morning, the storm had spent itself. The world outside the cabin was wrapped in a silence so complete it felt holy. Every pine bowed beneath a quilt of white, every fence post softened by snow. The air no longer bit, it sighed. From the chimney, a thin column of smoke rose into a sky still pale with dawn. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, throwing amber veins across the wooden floor and the still shapes that had survived the night together. Eleanor stirred first. Her eyes opened to the hush, and for a moment she did not know where she was. The quilt was rough against her skin, the air thick with the scent of pine and smoke and tea long gone cold. Then she saw the boy asleep by the hearth, one hand tucked beneath his chin, and the man sitting near the window, sharpening a knife by habit, his movements calm, deliberate. The storm had aged him another year overnight. She sat up slowly, her breath curling faintly in the air. "It's quiet," she said, voice still hoarse. Jesse looked up, his gray eyes softened by the firelight. "It'll stay that way now. Storm's gone east." She nodded, gaze lingering on the small panes of frost-rimmed glass. Beyond them, light spilled over the ridge like water breaking through a dam. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, she felt the tremor in her bones ease. "You've a good place here," she said, almost to herself. He gave a small shrug. "It's enough." When Tommy woke, he rubbed his eyes, blinked at her, and smiled shyly. That pure, unguarded smile of children who still believe every stranger might be a story waiting to begin. She smiled back, though something deep within her winced at the simplicity of it. By noon, Jesse had brewed coffee and warmed a pot of beans. They sat around the rough table near the fire, spoons clinking softly, the smell of salt pork and wood smoke filling the room. The woman's appetite was small, but she tried, if only out of gratitude. "You saved my life," she said quietly. Jesse's answer was a shrug and a sip of coffee. "Storm did most of the work. I just brought you in before it finished it." Her lips curved faintly. "Then I owe the storm my thanks too." Tommy looked between them, curiosity bright in his eyes. "Ma'am," he began carefully, "what's your name?" For a heartbeat, she hesitated. The fire popped, a log collapsing inward, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Eleanor," she said at last. "Eleanor Ward." "Ward," Jesse repeated, testing the name against the air. "I'm a widow," she added, her gaze steady but far away. "Been traveling alone since last spring. My husband, he died the winter before." The boy's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "I'm sorry," he murmured. Eleanor smiled gently, reaching to rest her hand over his for a moment. "You've kind manners, Tommy. Keep them. They're rarer than gold." Jesse watched the exchange in silence, the corner of his mouth tightening with something like understanding. When she looked up again, her eyes swept across the cabin, the mended chair by the fire, the tools hung in neat rows, the shelf of tin plates polished from use. And then she saw it. A framed photograph resting on the mantel, edges yellowed by time. A woman with soft eyes and a smile that seemed to know him better than the world ever could. "She was your wife," Eleanor said softly. Jesse set his cup down. 6 years gone," he replied. "I still catch myself setting a plate for her sometimes." Eleanor's gaze lingered on the picture, the way the light caught the curve of the woman's smile. "We never stop doing that, do we?" she said, her voice no louder than the fire's whisper, "setting a place for ghosts." He looked at her then, really looked, and in her expression saw the same hollow space that lived inside him, two strangers who understood the same language of loss without translation. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was communion. Tommy, sensing something he could not name, cleared his throat and began to talk about the horse, how Scout had stood all night by the shed, stamping his hooves like he was guarding them. The story loosened the air. Eleanor smiled at the boy's earnestness, and Jesse reached to ruffle his hair, grateful for the interruption. The day passed gently, the cabin breathing with life once more. Eleanor offered to help wash the dishes, and Jesse let her, though she moved carefully, as if every motion might disturb the fragile peace they had built. She hummed under her breath, an old tune Jesse didn't recognize, something that might have come from another life. By dusk, the light turned honey gold, spilling across the floorboards. Eleanor sat by the window with a blanket over her shoulders, watching the last of the snow melt from the trees. Jesse worked by the hearth, mending the strap of his saddle, and Tommy played with a small wooden horse he'd carved years ago. It was the kind of evening that made time hesitate, unremarkable, but sacred in its quiet. When night fell, they lit the lantern. The fire glowed softer now, its warmth more memory than heat. The three of them sat close, each lost in thought but not alone. Tommy asked for a story, and Eleanor told one, about a meadow in spring, about a mare and her foal that learned to run again after a long winter. Her voice was calm, melodic, filled with a tenderness that wrapped around the room like another blanket. Jesse listened, saying nothing, though the rhythm of her words eased something that had ached inside him for years. When the story ended, silence returned, comfortable and deep. Outside, the wind had gone to sleep. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. It felt full of breath, of warmth, of people alive enough to miss what they'd lost. Jesse stirred the fire one last time, watching the embers. Pulse red against the dark. "You'll rest easy tonight," he said quietly. "Storm's over." Eleanor nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "For now." The lantern flickered as a faint gust slid down the chimney, teasing the ashes in the hearth. Tommy had already drifted to sleep on the rug, his wooden horse clutched in one hand. Eleanor rose, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. She crossed to the door to latch it, but before she could, a stronger wind swept through, pushing it open with a sudden howl. Ashes scattered across the floor like black snow. The lantern swayed, its flame bending low, and there, half hidden beneath the table, the firelight caught on something, a piece of leather, worn and dusted with frost. Jesse bent to pick it up. It was a saddlebag, old but finely made, the initials stitched in faded gold thread. E.W. The wind died as suddenly as it had come. In the hush that followed, Eleanor's breath caught, the color draining from her face as Jesse turned toward her. The days that followed were stitched together with small mercies, sunlight creeping across thawing snow, the soft rhythm of chores shared in quiet companionship. The storm had left behind a brittle peace, the kind that made sound carry further and thoughts linger longer. Eleanor moved through the cabin like someone relearning the steps of living, slow at first, then with a grace that startled the stillness. Each morning she rose before the men, tying her dark hair neatly, folding her borrowed quilt, sweeping the hearth as though she had always belonged there. By the third day, she joined Tommy outside, helping him gather wood along the tree line. The boy laughed when she nearly slipped on a patch of ice, her muffled gasp turning into a sound she hadn't made in months. Laughter. It was brief, like sunlight breaking through clouds, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if to steady it. "You're better at this than I am," she told the boy, and Tommy, proud and flushed from the cold, replied, "You just need practice, ma'am." Jesse, watching from the porch with his coat collar turned up, smiled quietly into his beard. When she came inside, she mended his torn coat without being asked, her needle moving with quiet precision. She worked by the window's pale light, lips pressed together, the thread glinting as it passed through leather. "You do that well," Jesse remarked, hanging his hat on the wall. She didn't look up. "I've had practice too." Her tone was gentle but heavy, a voice that had known both comfort and command. The silence after was warm, not awkward, filled with the slow creak of wood and the whisper of wind easing through the eaves. At night, when Tommy slept curled by the fire, they spoke in fragments. Jesse told her about the forge in town, the long days of shoeing horses and fixing wagon wheels. She spoke little of herself, a habit of those who've carried secrets too far and too long. But in her gestures there were hints, the way she handled a teacup with the careful ease of someone raised among porcelain, or how her words carried the polish of schooling he had never known. Jesse began to notice more. Her boots, fine leather, the stitching delicate, the soles barely worn. Her gloves, embroidered along the cuffs, not the kind a traveler buys on a whim. Even her coat, though weather-beaten now, was of good wool, cut to fit a woman accustomed to being seen. And her hands, though scarred from recent hardship, bore the faint memory of rings, the kind left behind when you remove a life too heavy to keep. One afternoon, as the sun sank gold against the snowfields, Jesse caught her standing by the window, staring east. The light framed her face in quiet sorrow. "You're thinking about home," he said softly. She startled, then turned, the mask of composure slipping back into place. "Home is a word with too many meanings," she said. That night, the wind returned, not the screaming storm of before, but a soft, restless murmur through the chimney, as though the mountains themselves were whispering unfinished stories. Jesse lay awake on the cot near the wall, the faint glow of the fire outlining Eleanor's shape by the table. She sat there with the lamp turned low, shoulders hunched, a letter unfolded in her hands. The paper caught the light, cream-colored, thick, pressed with a seal that gleamed faintly in wax. Even from where he lay, Jesse could see the crest, a silver ridge framed by crossed cattle brands. He knew it at once. The Silver Ridge Cattle Company, the largest ranch in the territory, and one whose name was spoken with equal parts envy and caution in every saloon from Laramie to Carson's Crossing. Her eyes moved over the lines, her lips tracing words she didn't speak. The lamp flickered, wind pressing softly at the windows. For a moment, she looked carved from the same fragile light that danced over her hair, a woman caught between past and present. Jesse turned slightly on his cot, careful not to startle her, though curiosity gnawed at the edges of his restraint. When she finally folded the letter and set it down, she exhaled like someone surfacing from deep water. He thought she might rise then, douse the lamp and sleep, but instead her hand lingered on the paper, fingers trembling just once before stilling. "Couldn't sleep either." Jesse's voice was low, almost part of the dark. Eleanor stiffened, then turned, eyes wide and caught in lamplight. For a second, he thought she might deny it, hide the letter behind her back. But she didn't. She met his gaze squarely, not defensive, not ashamed, just tired of pretending. "I wasn't running from the storm," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I was running from my life." The words hung there, fragile as frost. The fire cracked once, sending a small spark leaping into the shadows. Jesse said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew the tone, the weight of confession from someone who had held it too long. She looked down at the letter again, eyes distant. "Silver Ridge," she whispered, almost to herself. "I built that place from nothing. After my husband died, it was all I had left to prove I still mattered. But the bigger it grew, the smaller I became." Her hand brushed the seal with something between bitterness and longing. "You ever look at something you made and realize it owns you?" Jesse leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Every time I walk into the forge," he said, "but at least metal doesn't lie." That drew the faintest smile from her, brittle, fleeting, but real. "You're lucky then," she murmured. Outside, the wind rose slightly, tapping the shutters like knuckles at a door. The lamp wavered. Eleanor folded the letter once more, slower this time, her eyes fixed on the crest as though memorizing it. Her voice, when it came, was little more than breath. "They'll come, looking for me," she whispered. Jesse's heart kicked hard against his ribs, but he said nothing. He only watched as she pressed the letter against her chest, the light of the lamp painting her face in gold and shadow, the portrait of a woman halfway between confession and fear. The fire sighed, the wind moved on, and in that fragile silence, Jesse understood what she hadn't said aloud. Storms never truly end. They just change their name. The morning she left, the mountains were still blue with sleep. Frost lay thick on the windows, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to a whisper. Jesse stirred awake at the faint creak of the door, but thought it was the wind. By the time he rose from his cot, the sound was gone. The cabin was empty except for the smell of cold air and the soft rustle of paper on the table. A note lay beneath the lamp, edges curled where the heat had reached it in the night. His name was written in her hand, strong, deliberate, as though every letter cost her something. He stood there for a long moment before picking it up, afraid of what it might take from him to read it. The handwriting trembled slightly, but the words did not. "You saved me once, Jesse Dalton. I don't know if I can ever repay that. But I'll remember." There was no signature, no goodbye. Just the weight of memory pressed into ink. Jesse read it twice, lips moving silently, then folded the paper with care and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. The cabin felt colder after that, as though even the walls knew something had been taken from them. Outside, the world had moved on without her. The snow had melted into rivulets that cut through the frozen ground, and the air carried the scent of wet pine and earth waking again. Tommy came running from the shed, cheeks red, arms full of kindling. "Pa, she gone?" he asked quietly, as if the question itself might change the answer. Jesse nodded once, eyes on the ridge. "She's gone." Days became routine again, the kind of rhythm that filled the silence but never replaced it. Jesse returned to the forge in town, the anvil's ring echoing through the street from dawn to dusk. The shop smelled of smoke, oil, and iron, all the things that made sense to him. Yet sometimes, between hammer strikes, he'd find himself staring at the door, half expecting the sound of boots softer than his own to cross the threshold. Tommy noticed, though he said nothing. He simply kept closer to his father, watching the way Jesse's eyes lingered too long on the horizon. The boy had grown quieter since Eleanor's leaving, like someone who had heard a story end before he was ready. Nights were the hardest. The cabin felt too large for two voices. Jesse would read by the fire while Tommy slept, the note tucked in his Bible beside his late wife's photograph. Winter eased into early spring. The snow lines crept higher up the mountains, and the rivers ran faster. Still, no word came. Jesse told himself he didn't expect any. People like her, people with means, with lives built far from cabins and forges, didn't return to men like him. But the heart doesn't understand class or distance. It only knows the space someone leaves behind. It was late afternoon when the rider appeared. Jesse was at the forge, sleeves rolled, hammering the edge of a plowshare when the sound of hooves echoed down the lane. He looked up to see a man, dismount, not a ranch hand, not a drifter, but someone dressed for business rather than trail dust. The man's suit was gray, his gloves polished, his boots shining even beneath the dust of travel. His horse, a tall chestnut gelding, pawed the ground impatiently. "Mr. Dalton?" the man called, voice crisp and formal. Jesse set his hammer down, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's me." The stranger reached into his coat and drew out an envelope sealed with silver wax. The emblem on it caught the sun, a ridge and two crossed cattle brands. "From Mrs. Eleanor Ward of Silver Ridge," he said. The name struck like the ringing of his anvil. Jesse stared, half expecting the man to retract it as a mistake. But the rider stood steady, holding out the letter as if it were a verdict. Jesse wiped his hands again before taking it, his calloused fingers dwarfing the elegant fold of paper. He broke the seal with his thumb. The parchment inside was thick, scented faintly of lavender, the same fragrance he remembered clinging to her scarf. His eyes traced the opening line, and the forge seemed to fade around him until there was only her voice, quiet and steady, speaking from the page. "Jesse, I wasn't honest with you. I am the owner of Silver Ridge Ranch. I built it after my husband died, but the work made me forget why I ever wanted to build anything at all. You and your boy reminded me of warmth, of purpose. If you'll come, I'd like you to manage the Copper Creek branch, not as an employee, but as a partner." The words blurred slightly as his breath hit the paper. He read them again, slower this time, each sentence heavier than the last. There was no mention of apology, only honesty. No promises, only invitation. It was, in its own way, more intimate than any confession could have been. Jesse looked up at the messenger, who sat quietly astride his horse now, reins slack in his hands. The man's expression was unreadable, the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered news but not emotion. Behind him, the road wound westward, sun gleaming on distant hills that shimmered faintly with green. Tommy came running from the workshop, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Who's that, Pa?" he asked. Jesse didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the letter, on the signature written in elegant script. Eleanor Ward, Silver Ridge Ranch. He folded the letter carefully, pressing it flat with his palm before sliding it back into the envelope. Then he looked up at the writer. The decision had already been made, somewhere between her words and the memory of her laughter echoing in the cabin. "Tell her," he began, voice low but sure. "I'll bring my son." The man nodded once, touched his hat, and turned his horse toward the road. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the slow breath of wind through the forge and the faint shimmer of silver wax in Jesse's hand. He stood there for a long while, the letter heavy against his chest. The mountains to the west glowed with evening light, their slopes dusted gold where the sun broke through the clouds. Jesse glanced at Tommy, whose eyes were bright with questions he didn't yet know how to ask. "Pack up your things, boy," Jesse said quietly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like we've got somewhere to be." Tommy's face lit up with the kind of hope that had been missing for weeks. He ran toward the cabin, his laughter scattering across the yard like birds startled into flight. Jesse watched him go, then turned back toward the forge. The anvil gleamed where the last rays of sun touched it, a reminder of what he was leaving behind and what waited ahead. That night, the forge went dark early. The tools were cleaned, the fire smothered. Jesse stood outside beneath the paling sky, letter in one hand, his wife's old wedding ring in the other. He closed his fist around both, past and future caught in the same grasp, and whispered into the wind that carried west. "Thank you, Eleanor." The road to Silver Ridge was long and sunlit, winding between acres of pasture that rolled like green waves under the early evening light. Dust trailed behind the two riders, golden and soft in the fading sun. Jesse rode tall in the saddle, the brim of his hat casting shadow over eyes that had seen too much winter and just enough forgiveness to begin again. Beside him, Tommy's small frame bobbed slightly with each stride of his pony, his laughter mingling with the rustle of grass and the rhythm of hooves against earth. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks catching the last light of day, guardians of a valley that seemed to hold its breath, waiting. They saw the fences first, white, endless, gleaming in the dusk like a promise kept. The kind of fences that said someone cared enough to build boundaries not out of pride, but out of protection. Beyond them stretched fields of grazing cattle, tails flicking lazily, and barns painted red against the pale gold of sunset. It was a place that spoke of order, of labor, of roots sunk deep in the soil. Tommy's eyes widened at the sight. "Pa," he said, half whispering, "it's bigger than the whole town." Jesse smiled faintly. "Maybe so, son, but it still needs mending like everything else." When they turned up the final stretch of road, the main house came into view, 2 stories of pale wood and wide porches, windows glinting like glass eyes watching the horizon. And there, on the porch, she stood, Eleanor. Her black dress fluttered faintly in the wind, though the grief that had once clung to it seemed lighter now, softened at the edges. The setting sun framed her in amber light, catching the streaks of silver in her dark hair and the faint smile that trembled on her lips. Jesse slowed his horse to a walk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years that had aged them, loss, storms, silence, seemed to hover between them, waiting to be named and then finally released. When he dismounted, the creak of the saddle was the only sound between them. "You came," she said, her voice steady but low, as if she didn't trust the moment to stay. "You asked," Jesse replied, and the corners of his mouth lifted just slightly. Eleanor's gaze searched his, not for love, not even for forgiveness, but for truth. "I wasn't sure you'd forgive the lie," she said quietly. Jesse looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "There's nothing to forgive," he said. "You just needed a place to remember who you were." For the first time in what felt like years, Eleanor laughed, soft and incredulous. The sound startled even her. It was not the laughter of joy exactly, but of release, like the breath one takes after surfacing from deep water. She took a step forward, the wooden boards creaking beneath her boots. Behind them, Tommy had already slid off his pony. He ran toward the barn, calling to the stable hands, eager to explore the maze of corrals and hay bales that waited there. His laughter carried across the yard, high and pure, filling the valley like the echo of something holy. Jesse watched him go, a smile tugging at his face. "He'll make himself at home quicker than we will," he said. Eleanor followed his gaze, eyes glistening. "Children have a way of doing that," she murmured. "They forgive the world before it even knows it's sorry." A breeze swept through the fields then, bending the tall grass like a gentle bow. Somewhere, a windmill turned slowly, its blades sighing with the rhythm of the land. The smell of hay and spring clover drifted between them, warm and grounding. They stood in silence for a long time. There was no need for explanation, no space for regret, only the recognition of two people who had carried grief so long it had worn itself smooth inside them. Eleanor extended her hand. "Partners?" she asked, her voice almost playful but trembling, just enough to betray the weight of what she meant. Jesse looked at her hand, then at her. This woman who had arrived in his life wrapped in frost and silence, and now stood before him, surrounded by sunlight and breath. He reached out, his calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "Partners," he said. The words settled between them, simple, solid, and real. They stood that way for a while, two figures framed against the dying light. The sun dipped behind the ridge, turning the sky to a wash of rose and gold. The fields shimmered, the cattle lowed softly, and somewhere beyond the barn, Tommy's laughter rang out again. Eleanor's eyes filled with a quiet peace. "You know," she said, almost whispering, "when I built Silver Ridge, I thought I was building walls to keep the world out. Turns out I was just waiting for someone to open the gate." Jesse chuckled low in his throat. "Well," he said, "I've never been much good at gates, but I can fix a hinge or two." She smiled then, truly smiled, and the lines of sorrow that had once shaped her face eased, replaced by the faintest hint of lightness. She turned toward the porch steps, gesturing for him to follow. "Come inside," she said. "You both look like you've ridden through more than one winter." As they stepped onto the porch, the first stars began to blink awake over the ridges. The air grew cooler, touched with the promise of spring. Jesse glanced back once. The valley spread below, silver in the twilight, the fences glowing faintly like threads of light. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil and cedar. A fire burned low in the hearth, its light flickering against walls hung with paintings of horses and rivers, of things built by hands and hope. On a small side table near the door sat a lantern, old, dented, and familiar. Jesse paused. "That's the one from the cabin," he said quietly. Eleanor turned, her smile soft but sure. "It seemed wrong to leave it there," she said. "It still knows how to keep the dark away." He reached out, brushing his fingers against the glass. The flame inside burned steady, the same light that had once saved her from the storm, now resting here, on her porch, as if it had finally found where it belonged. Outside, the wind carried the scent of hay and damp earth, mingled with something new, the faint sweetness of lilacs blooming too early in the season. The land around Silver Ridge seemed to breathe again, alive and patient. And somewhere deep inside her chest, Eleanor felt a stillness she hadn't known in years, the kind that comes not from forgetting pain, but from understanding it. She glanced toward Jesse, who stood by the fire, his hand resting on the lantern, his face lit by the same gentle flame. In that light, she realized she hadn't just been saved from the storm, she'd been saved from herself. Outside, the night gathered softly around the ranch, wrapping it in peace. The lantern on the porch burned through the dark, its glow steady against the wind, a small, stubborn light that had seen them through the cold, and now, at last, would see them home. There are storms that tear the land apart, and others that move quietly through the heart. Sometimes It isn't thunder or wind we survive, but the silence that follows, the long winters inside us when loss feels heavier than snow. Yet every now and then, life places someone in our path, not to rescue us, but to remind us that we're still capable of warmth, still capable of beginning again. What we keep in the end are not the years or the miles, but the small mercies that found us when the world grew cold, a steady hand, a quiet fire, a light left burning for someone who's still out there, trying to find their way home. If this story has touched something in you tonight, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and take a moment to subscribe, so you won't miss the next tale beneath these western skies, where every ending leaves behind a little hope for those who stay. Until then, may your nights be gentle, your roads kind, and may you always find a light waiting for you in the dark.